Welcome to the Property Business Accelerator podcast. I'm here today with award-winning property investor, Toby Spanier. For those that don't know me, I'm Mike Frisby. I've been in property investing now for almost 2 decades, and I've done a number of creative deals. I've focused on HMOs, buying properties, holding, doing them up and selling them on, and have now been working with investors and mentoring investors for about 15 years. Toby, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, I'm Toby Spanier. I'm a property investor. My previous life was as a management consultant for 25 years. And then the last 5 years of that, I started buying properties. And I've now been full-time in property investment for 2 years.
Brilliant. So here we are. We're sat at the end of 2024 and we're coming up to 2025. It's normally when I tell all the people within the Property Business Accelerator, think about next year, think about what the opportunities are, confirm your strategies for next year. So I thought I would ask you, what do you think the opportunities are for property investors in 2025?
I think 2025 will be a good time for property investors. I think we can see that interest rates are going to gradually edge their way down, and interest rates have a big effect on valuations of property. So if people in early 2025 start finding properties to buy, and the average conveyancing takes 5 months, probably takes them a month to find something, then they're already getting 6 months of capital appreciation for free before they've even bought the property. The property will probably have gone up in value. So I think that's a nice way to start. I think generally interest rates will be heading to a lower point of between 3 and 4% at some point over the next 2-3 years. So I think that's a good time to get back into property. I think that has a huge effect. It makes it easier for people to borrow money, easier for owner-occupiers to borrow money, and that's what really sets the price of residential property. I also think this is a good time to start going into mixed use or commercial property. If you've already bought a few residential properties and you want to start to branch out, I wouldn't say start with this. I would say move gradually into this if you've already built up a small portfolio of residential property. I think there's some good savings to be had in terms of stamp duty. And I think something that's mixed use, where there's an element of residential that people are used to and a small element of commercial, is a great way for them to break into this into a new area.
Yeah, I tend to agree with those things. So I think we're going to see these interest rates come down, as you said. So where would you be looking? So, how would you be targeting these opportunities you'd be talking about?
Well, I have a sourcing agent who is brilliant, who gives me deals all the time to my precise criteria. I get them every Sunday as a list in a single email, and for this I pay my sourcing agent nothing, because my sourcing agent is Rightmove, and I have Rightmove, and then I have a piece of software called Excel, a spreadsheet, and those are the 2 systems that I have. So I don't pay anything for my deals. I like to buy things that people want to sell. I don't do much off-market stuff because there's a lot of stuff on the market that isn't selling that I know I can get for a good price. So, yeah, just set your criteria on Rightmove, draw the circle of how big your area is, define what price range you want to be in, and Rightmove will send you an email on a Sunday once a week of all the properties that fulfill those criteria. I tend to like to look at properties that haven't been shifting. They've been on the market for a while because I know that the vendors can be more motivated to sell. I do the same thing with Rightmove Commercial, and I think if people want to move into that area, buying these sort of fairly cheap shops with tops is a good place to start. Anything around 220,000 is a good number because typically it's hard to get a commercial or mixed-use mortgage for less than £150,000 of actual loan, because it's still the same amount of work that the organisations need to do in terms of underwriting. So they kind of got a minimum size. There's a good market for that 150K. It tends to be 70% loan to value. So you want to be negotiating properties at that sort of 220 mark, which can, it can give you properties all around the country. I buy down south. Lots of properties are residential uppers, a flat upstairs with a shop downstairs. And I think that's a good way to start to grow into the commercial area. You get the advantages of the stamp duty, which is quite significant now. That's could save you a 5% on the purchase price. And you've got two cash flows coming in because you'll have a commercial part and a residential part. You'll understand the residential bit because that's what you've been doing, and then you'll get used to the commercial aspect by having a commercial tenant.
Yeah, and also I think for you, knowing what you've done in the past, and I think again, 2025 is going to be right for this. Is obviously you target land. Quite often you're looking at landlord type properties, whether obviously it's commercial, so it's going to be an investor who's selling, and what you do is work with that investor and do some form of creative financing. So I do think, are you feeling that there's going to be a lot more creative finance deals available next year as well?
I think there's potential for loads more creative. It's just lots of people don't think it's possible. And part of the reason why I wanted to do this podcast with you is just to make people aware that this stuff happens all the time. Just because there's not a training program on it doesn't mean that you can't do it. It's pretty straightforward once you've heard the principle. I remember hearing the principle of a purchase lease option back in 2020, and within a couple of months, I'd agreed one. So the principles of these things are not very difficult. It's having the confidence to talk to a vendor and come up to agree with them. But invariably, you need to agree something that's got something in it for them. And I think often these things don't work when people try and change the terms and also change the price. But if they can deliver to the vendor a number they want, but you can negotiate on the terms so it makes it affordable to you, then that works really well.
It's about creating that win-win scenario.
It is. I mean, I think the first mixed-use property I bought, which was back in 2021, it was a barber shop with a flat upstairs. I noticed it was cheaper than buying a residential property in the same area of the same size. I did nothing with the property whatsoever. I should be selling it tomorrow. So I've had a look at the numbers. And what's interesting is because there's one property but two income streams, it actually has been quite profitable. And it's been more profitable than my HMOs, even though I've done nothing with the property. Whereas with the HMOs, typically I'd buy a house, convert it to HMO, spend more and more money on it, refinance it, but still leave that deposit in there. So one advantage is just how sort of hands-off it's been. The commercial part manages itself. The residential part I haven't done much to. But you've got two cash flows rather than one.
Yeah, so I think, so to answer the question of 2025 for me, I tend to agree with a lot of the things you said. I think interest rates will come down, albeit slower than we probably anticipated 6 months ago, thanks to the budget that wasn't that growth orientated, despite it being marketed as a growth orientated budget. So I think there's going to be inflationary pressures that keep interest rates coming down, but not as quickly as we anticipated. So as you say, over the 2 or 3 year period. But that does mean that property prices, I think, will start to continue to be buoyant. I think there's going to be a mad panic before the stamp duty change in April this year for the residential buyers. So that's why I like moving up a level. So I think move up a level into the kind of 500k, £1 million plus area, because then you'll find more deals. I think landlords are going to continue to sell up. They don't like the renters' rights bill coming ahead. That always scares people. If you've been in the game a long time, you're probably going to say, well, I've probably made some good capital growth because obviously over the last 5 years we've had some good capital growth. I'm going to exit. So I think there's going to be portfolios for sale, large blocks for sale, mixed-use buildings for sale. And also, so we can do creative deals around, portfolios, title splitting, all these kind of things. So I think the creative deal structure will be big. Take control of it, use the building to pay for itself, which is core strategies that we use on the Property Business Accelerator program. And I think these are kind of some of the opportunities out there for everybody. But I think you also need, having some form of high cash flow strategy is always critical, despite the fact interest rates are coming down, because that allows more money going around to help these creative deals. So I think people ought to focus in on that as well. And I think there's going to be, you have to look at the trends. The stamp duty is also pushing people into this area for me as well. If you're buying, a number of units, you can switch to the commercial. So buildings that attract the commercial rates of stamp duty as opposed to the residential It's so much cheaper. That also helps, doesn't it? So it makes the world go round. And then, I think those are the key things. But just again, get good at negotiating and find win-win deals, as you're saying, that satisfy the vendor. And I think you can continue to do deals. I think we're fairly aligned on where we think the opportunities are.
And I think the bigger the property, the more units it has, the harder it is to sell. People want one flat, they don't want to buy 4 flats. So it's quite hard for these landlords to exit, and they're really just looking for someone who can transact. And they're more open to some form of negotiation because they are business people looking to exit their business. And they know it's tough because they will find it's tough. It's hard to sell properties for the values that they think those properties are worth. But it's easy to do it if you can actually talk directly with the vendor and come up with some kind of plan that helps both of you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is because, a lot of these creative deals have been happening in the commercial world for a very long time, and commercial landlords do realise that it is difficult. Because if you think about it, if you buy £1 million building, you need, over 300k now because of the stamp duty and everything. You need over 300k cash to buy it, and that limits the purchasing power. And like, if you have a building that is worth that amount of money, but that's not in London, how much demand is there for it? If it's not in a major city as well, how much demand is there? There's only limited investors who will do it, and they know that they can only achieve good prices if they work with the buyer to allow them to achieve that. And I think that's the mentality. Sometimes they're not aware of these things, and if you introduce them and the greed gets better of them because you give them nice big figures, I think it is. But it's a tool and trick that's been used, I think, for years. But I think residential buyers who are in their residential space don't necessarily think about it so much. And I think if you can push people into these bigger opportunities and slightly more commercial opportunities, there's a huge opportunity there. So that
kind of brings us on to the next topic, Mike, which is, what do you think you need to have to be a successful property investor?
It's a really good question. I think there's a few things that I think really, really help people. I mean, I think, one, you need to be a fantastic problem solver. Every deal that I come across has a problem somewhere. There's always a problem within the process of either negotiating it or buying it. The banks ask 101 questions and pose all these problems. And it's like, how do you solve these problems? Sometimes these buildings don't have clear planning status. Sometimes, so there's lots and lots and lots of things that come up. So you have to be a good problem solver. You solve problems on a regular basis and do those. The other thing is, and not to get too scared by that. So, have a support network that you can fall back on, ask advice to help sometimes with that problem solving technique. I think persistence as well. Keep going at it. Keep going, whether that's a deal. So I know, for example, some of your deals, you've probably taken 18 months, maybe even 2 years to negotiate some big deals. So yes, some deals land like that, but sometimes it takes persistence and follow-ups and watching and seeing what and allowing the despair to hit the landlord. So I think, problem solving, persistence, being in an environment that is, high-performing environment. So having good high-performing habits, get into routines, build routines, do things on a regular basis. You've already mentioned that, you get an email every weekend that tells you what, and then you review the deals and you go through that cycle, and that's consistent, isn't it? It happens on a weekly basis. I call it sowing the seeds. If I've talked to you about this term before, haven't I? So you're constantly sowing seeds, and eventually your deals. So as I said, you sometimes get deals that pop up, and the seed germinates quickly, and you can grab it and take that opportunity. Sometimes you have to keep watering these seeds, following up, and doing it. I remember one of the deals that you talked about where persistence and problem solving were it. You offered something, and I think it was this old lady who was selling, or this lady who was selling, and then she was no, and then she came back to you, and then you went, right, okay, I can now really offer the really good price that works for you, and they just by that point were sort of a bit desperate, and anything was good for them, so it kind of worked. So I think just be consistent, but guess clarity as well. So decisivity and clarity. Know what works for you and what doesn't. Don't be distracted by all the shiny pennies. A lot of us have that. So I think certainly clarity in itself also works. So problem solving, persistence, having clarity around what you're trying to achieve and where you're going. Make sure you build that business that you want at the end of it. I see some property investors building noisy, busy businesses that they wanted to escape their day job and do this. They're so desperate to get every little bit of cash flow. They do things everywhere and anywhere. And then they built something they don't want that controls them, and they don't have that freedom. So have a clear vision as well about where you're heading and what you want to do. So yeah, those I think are some of my varied things that make people successful as property investors.
I would agree with all of them. The persistence is really key because you kind of get a lot of no's in property. But the angle I have on persistence is about not just doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results, but following up and then following through. So the initial portfolio that I just bought basic asking price or a little bit less. They were not my best deals. But the second portfolio I bought, I often had rejections, and that was fine. I got to a number that I was comfortable with. The other side wasn't comfortable with it. Someone would outbid me, fine. But they went into the spreadsheet. So every deal that I offered on went into the spreadsheet. Once a month, I would phone up the agents and say, this property, has it exchanged yet? They go, oh, no, it's going to happen next month. Fine. I'd phone up again next month. And what I would find is I'd phone up and they go, oh, no, it's that's really interesting. Yes, it's falling through. I can't remember what your offer was. Are you still interested? And I'll say, yes, this is the offer I gave several months ago. I'm still interested. I'm ready. Here's my solicitor details. Here's my proof of finance. And I picked a lot of properties up that way. So it is persistence. It's not giving up when you get the initial no. It's the following up and then following through that's really, really helped and allowed me to expand my portfolio. The other thing that I want to talk about is that clarity. I think really, but the way I would talk about it is about backing yourself. No one's going to back you until you back yourself. You've got to have confidence in who you are, because otherwise you'll never make a decision. You'll find the best deal in the world and you'll persuade yourself there's something wrong with it. So you have to have the courage of your conviction and follow through with that. And that does require some clarity. So you need to work out what is your strategy and stick to it. Otherwise you get distracted and you'll never end up doing anything at all. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
So it's what to say no to. So it's about being clear about who you are, and it's also about saying no to things.
Yes, and I think the most important letter of property is the why, because the why stands for you. You've got to find a strategy that fits well with you. I started with a strategy of HMOs, which I think I now know stands for high maintenance operation. There's lots of moving parts in an HMO, and it didn't really fit very well with my character. I prefer to do a set and forget. I prefer to think about a deal, structure it, and then it becomes quite simple and I can hand over the execution to someone else because there's not very much to execute. And I'd chosen a strategy that does make money, but didn't fit well with me. There was a lot of my time spent chasing agents, trying to work out why there were voids, what was actually going wrong, why was the maintenance bill too high, and that just took up a lot of time, which didn't sit well with me. I found there was a portfolio drag that was preventing me buying more stuff. And the bit that I was good at doing was structuring the deals up front and buying well rather than executing complex property strategies after purchase. So I think once I worked that out, I then worked out perhaps HMO wasn't for me, but a more buy-to-let or commercial property or multiple dwellings, blocks of flats basically, was the right strategy for me. And that really helped propel me in the last 18 months. Because strategy is as much about saying no to things as it is saying yes to things. And if you don't say no to things, you don't actually have a strategy. You just consume your time spinning, but not actually achieving.
Yeah, I think people they hear people speak, they go to network meetings, they hear people speak, and it's the latest strategy, and they think, wow. And yes, that person has been successful at that strategy. But likewise, the month before, they'd listened to someone else who'd also been equally successful with another strategy. It's not about the strategy, it's about the person implementing that strategy. And as you say, relying, have a clear vision of where you want to go. And I think maybe you hadn't worked out what your vision was why you went into HMOs. And I think, if you do go into HMOs, I think HMOs are great for getting quick cash flow, building up that cash flow pot. But you don't hear people who have thousands of rooms. You hear of people having lots and thousands of properties, but it's not in the HMO world. You get to a certain point and you've got the cash flow, and there's other easier forms of property investing, in my view. It does wonder, it gets you to a certain place. Absolutely critical for some people, I think, in their journey. But if you're going to do HMOs, either you're going to be, you obviously you were doing HMOs at a distance, which
another mistake.
I think is a little bit harder. You either have to build, in my view, a team behind it to allow that noise to disappear, and they deal with the noise, which is one of the things that I did when scaling my property, my HMO portfolio. But I think also with that vision, and I talk about, where do you want to end up? You want to end up with this, what I call a calm castle. This castle is a really robust thing that you've got that's burning off money. But I say calm because I don't want it to be noisy. I don't want it to be all these things. Long-term commercial property on decent yields is very calm because you're dealing with long-term leases and stuff rather than individual stuff. Lots of people are going into Airbnb. That's busy and noisy. Again, you need to build a team behind that to actually make that work for you. You've got to build the infrastructure behind it. So that's got to be part of your plan. And if your vision, if you want something calm to, whatever it is, spend time with the family, go traveling, whatever you desire, you've got to think about, okay, well, when I'm successful, which of course you need to have that mindset, you need to know what you're aiming for. And almost, I think, people stop themselves if they're like uncertain about what that vision is because they're like scared of it. It's like, oh my God, what happens if I get all these rooms? What happens if I am successful? I've got all these rooms I've got to manage. And they don't really want that. So they kind of block themselves.
I mean, I think that reflects what I had. I started buying in 2017, bought very quickly. With my brother, we got to 75 HMO rooms really quickly.
Wow, that's good, yeah.
And then the question was, well, we're heading towards 100. We kind of now need to set up our own maintenance organisation, management organisation, and take this in-house. And is that something that I want to manage? And is that really my skill set? And it wasn't. And I remember you asked me the question, what would you like your son to inherit? And I thought, do I want him to inherit a whole bunch of high maintenance operation HMO rooms, or do I want something which is a bit more straightforward? And it's not necessarily about the number of properties.
No.
I'd like my son to inherit just 10 properties, but if they are all blocks of flats in central London, then that's a lot easier, isn't it? So that helped me gain the clarity of actually I realised I was ready to step up to bigger deals, and that meant more of my time and focus was spent on the front end, where that's my skill set. I have a better skill set for that, structuring at the front end.
I do find that a lot of people get into this for legacy, and then you ask that question of like, I love the question I asked you, which I think is a bit of a killer question in terms of setup. It's like, would you want your children to inherit that? And like, do they really want, if they don't want to go into property, they don't want to be managing all this stuff. And a lot of children don't want to do what their parents did. They don't have the same interests, and they haven't had the same life experience. So you want to have something calm that can be passive in the background. And if anything happens to you.
Totally. I mean, I haven't met a property investor or property developer who doesn't say that the reason they're doing it is for their family. So it does pay to think about, well, once you're gone, what are you leaving for your family? What would they have to deal with? And are you happy with that? And that helped give me some really good clarity, which is one of those characteristics.
Yeah, and reflecting and learning. Which brings me on to another question that I've got, which is, give me a couple of key learnings along this property investing journey that you've had, a couple of key takeaways that you've had that you think would be really useful for the listeners to know about.
So I think it's good to have started with a portfolio, to have operated it, and then to have sold it, because I've seen the cradle to grave process. And I didn't really understand what I was doing until I'd sold the last property, because life has to be lived forwards but can only be understood backwards. And you need to be far enough away from the events in order to have some perspective. During the time I was just busy building, but not really thinking about what I was building. So the first thing I would say, and this was the first 10 properties that I bought, which I bought very quickly. I bought 9 of them in the first 7 months when I started, and then the other 3 within the next sort of 18 months. The first thing I would say is I wasn't very good at predicting which properties would turn out well and which ones wouldn't. The ones that I thought weren't going to be very profitable actually sold for far more money. It wasn't about how much money I spent on them. It wasn't necessarily the HMOs with the most number of rooms. It really was purchase price and sales price and what happened in between. So the first thing I would say is you never quite know how things are going to turn out. So that's also, and often things I've been unsure about have turned out to be really good deals. You can't really tell at the time. So I think, what does that mean? I think back yourself, and if you think it looks like a reasonable deal, and you think you can live with the possible likely downside if things go wrong, there are levers you can pull to get you out of that situation, then go for it. Otherwise, you just won't do any deals at all. The second thing I'd like to say is property is very forgiving, especially in a rising market. And over a 5-year period, normally there's a rising market. I mean, unless you bought in 2008 just before the crash, but even then we were back at sort of 2013 was the pre-2008 prices. So over a 5-year period, property tends just to go up, most of the time. You might be unlucky with, one cycle, but what it meant was even the purchases I did which weren't great, they still made money. And I made money largely from the capital appreciation more than the cash flow. The cash flow was good, it serviced the debt, it kept the wheels moving, but the big chunks of money really came from when I sold the properties.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because you're saying you actually made the money out of selling the properties rather than the cash flow, and that was even though you were doing an HMO strategy.
Doing a high cash flow strategy, and it was galling because when I reviewed the numbers, I realised if I'd bought all the same properties, but then just stopped, just didn't convert any of them to HMO, and then sold them 4 years later, I would have made a lot more money. And what was happening was I was spending £30,000, £40,000 converting these properties to HMO. A large part of that with a licensed HMO is doing things that don't have any market value, but they do have a regulatory value. So once you're into 5 rooms, you need to pay for a license. Once you're into 5 rooms, you're going to have to start moving walls in a house that's typically a 3-bedroom house in order to get the right size rooms for all the 5 rooms. You'll have to put a fire alarm in, you'd have to put loads of fire doors in. So you've got these costs that aren't making the building more valuable. And when you come to sell it, if it's a standard HMO, it's going to have a price similar to what nice properties in the area sell for, even though it's an HMO. So I was buying properties, spending money on them. That gave me the license to have a high cash flow strategy, to get more money out of them than a buy-to-let. And I was refinancing them, and the refinance would pay back the refurb, but didn't pay much back of the deposit. And so basically I was in a similar situation when I came to sell than if I just bought a property, rented it out and sold it without that refurb period. I also had a 6-9 month period in those 4 years where I wasn't getting any income because I was converting these properties. And people never think about that number to put in their spreadsheet. They just think about the end point of when it's all full, then it's cash flow nicely, then it's a great return.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, if we look back at that portfolio that you built, I think probably wasn't enough discount when you were going in. So some of the learnings out of that to me were like probably not enough discount when going in. Also, 4-bed HMOs, I think, unless they're maybe students, are difficult to make money from unless they're really, really cheap prices because, you kind of have fixed costs. If you get to 5, 6, for me, the magic's in 6 and 7. So you've not, you kind of like, if you had a 5th bedroom in these properties or a 6th bedroom, your costs would probably be similar, maybe a little bit more on the mortgage, but essentially those 2 rooms are the profit. And you had the 4, which was covering the mortgage and then covering the bills, covering the each room, probably 2 rooms for a mortgage, a room for the maintenance and bills, and then a room for the managing agent. So there was no slack in there whatsoever. So it kind of like disappeared. So you need to but what you did was evaluate it, make a decision and move on. So that was good. So you've got to manage, monitor and modify what you're doing. And I think otherwise you just repeat the same mistake. And if you scale quickly, you can repeat
As
the
I
same
did.
mistake.
I repeated the same mistake 7 times or 9 times in the first 7 months because I hadn't even finished the first HMO by the time I'd committed by the night of property.
So what you've got to do, what I feel, a key learning, one of my key learnings is that you need to master what you're doing. You need to get under the skin to understand the nuances of that strategy. So in reality, I think, maybe it would have been a different kettle of fish if you'd moved into the commercial world of financing quicker, got to the position where you could commercially finance some of these, so you're likely to recycle more of your cash. Mm-hmm. These 6th and 7th and 8th bedrooms would be then getting you some profit out of these things. And for me, that's the nuance. You have to get deep. So a lot of people just pick up these strategies and go, I'll do that. They pick up, like, go to a network meeting. I do HMOs. They haven't really mastered that. And you've got to, like, the first one, second one, evaluate, You've got to master a strategy and get into it and get under the skin. And that's when you actually do really well with it. And then you can repeat and scale if you want to, but mastering it. So I think one key learning, and I observe, is I focus on a particular area and master it. Whether that's been, when initially I was doing a lot of creative financing, kind of mastered the creative financing. Then we had the credit crunch, and kind of like I was looking for cash flow. I found cash flow through social housing. I did a lot in social housing. Once I'd done social housing, I'd also realised I could get really good rents. So I then went into what is now known rent to rent. I did a lot of leases with landlords and took on their properties and managed theirs and managed it for more than a managing agent. So therefore I made money out of that. So again, I worked out what all that was. And again, as you say, you go through the whole cycle. Of handing back. So when I got into teaching that kind of strategy, I think a lot of other people were teaching it, but all they'd done is take on properties. And I was looking at it very differently to what everybody else. And I saw lots of people get into trouble with that because they hadn't been through the whole cycle of what they're doing there. Then we went into HMOs and I mastered that strategy and commercial financing. Part of mastering a strategy for me is also then going out and teaching it. And that's when you really mastered it. And then I'm back to creative financing and buying businesses and portfolios back again, kind of where I started, full loop. But it's like, I think key learnings there: master a strategy, whether it's an area, a strategy, whatever it is, master it, focus on it, put it to bed, systemize it, put it to bed, and move on. Another key learning, I think, is just always be open and to learn and develop and be realistic about what you have, who you are, and what your limitations are. And, I think you constantly have to learn. Things change. In any walk of life, you have to continue. You can't stand still. You have to continue to develop and learn. Any entrepreneur has to do this. The only constant in life is change, so keep changing. Keep up with what's going on, so that you keep abreast of things and that you're kind of ahead of the game. Think about things, and basically work on your business, not just in it, and be strategic with everything that you do, as well as being very action orientated. I don't know whether that's given any learnings, but I think those things are really good traits.
Definitely.
I think that's probably us then.
Yeah.